Let's get to our panel. Joining us in the studio is Clare Lopez. She's the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Centre for Security Policy. From London, we're joined by Sami Hamdi. He's the President and Editor-in-Chief of The International Interest, a current affairs magazine. And Simon Marks is the President and Chief Correspondent of Feature Story News right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Simon, let's start where Nathan left us, and that's Syria and the war there. The U.S. brings down a Syrian plane. Russia then threatens that it will target any aircraft in what it calls its area of operations. Isn't this how wars start?
Well, I mean, I think Nathan set it out absolutely correctly. The big issue, the big question now is who is at the helm of the ship of state as far as foreign policy is concerned. I'd use a slightly different analogy. This situation on the ground in Syria is like a tinderbox. Donald Trump is wandering around with a Twitter account that acts as the equivalent of a man kind of flicking the flint on a cigarette lighter. At any point, any ember can fly off that cigarette lighter and really spark some kind of a conflagration here. Meanwhile, you've got the fire brigade behind the scenes in the form of the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, in the form of the Defense Secretary James Mattis, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, telling everybody that comes into contact with them that, as James Mattis recently described himself to a visiting defense minister, he's the secretary of reassurance in the Trump administration, the man who's out there to basically say, don't panic, we've got this. But at the end of the day, he's the president of the United States. And so it's very unclear that there's a harmonious approach here. On the issue of Syria, dealing with Russia, you had the Ukrainian leader, Petro Poroshenko, at the White House today. Didn't even get the courtesy of a joint press conference with Donald Trump, who referred to Ukraine as the Ukraine, hearkening back to an era when Ukraine was not an independent state. Meanwhile, the Treasury today is taking a much tougher line, sanctioning 38 individuals and entities and punishing them for the role they played in the annexation of Crimea, a phrase Donald Trump never actually uses. So I think it's chaos.
Claire, if we look at the situation in Syria, you've got a volatile situation there, which, as Simon points out, could spiral into more violence. Is there a lack of clarity on what the U.S. wants to do there?
I think what we really do need to see from the Trump administration at the top levels is a clear definition of U.S. strategic national objectives. In other words, what is the end state that we seek to obtain there? What is the end state that is best for U.S. national security? Of course, as the Islamic State is being pushed back and out of different areas that previously had controlled, and other combatants are moving into those spaces, it's becoming very crowded. And I mean, just as Simon says, the chance for a miscalculation rises. But without a clear national security strategy, what is it that the United States needs to see as a final outcome? What is the ultimate outcome that we're seeking to obtain? Without that, it does become very confusing.
Here's the puzzling thing, Claire. Russia, the United States, or for that matter, as Nathan pointed out, Iran, are ostensibly on the same side in this war, aren't they?
No, not quite. What I would say is that what you're looking at in the former Syria, and the former Iraq, for that matter, is the newest iteration of a nearly 1,400-year-old intra-Islamic sectarian struggle between Shiites and Sunnis. And then each of them have their own backers in terms of great nation powers. There is an axis of Baghdad, Beirut, Damascus, Tehran. That is the Shiite axis. And opposing them is a group of many different militias on the ground, of Sunni militias, right. Many Al-Qaeda or Muslim Brotherhood connected.
OK, let's bring Sami Hamdi in London. Sami, talking of Iran, it launched a ballistic missile on an ISIS target, and officials in Tehran say it was not only a response to terror attacks against Iranians in Tehran, but it was also a warning to the United States and Saudi Arabia. Now, you get this ballistic missile launched by Iran against ISIS targets. How does that complicate the situation in Syria?
I think one thing that we have to be aware of is that when Obama was trying to conduct his own foreign policy on Syria, he was haunted by what happened in Libya, which was a brute force military intervention to oust Gaddafi, and the country descended into civil war because the different parties couldn't agree. So when Syria came about, Obama didn't want to use brute force. When we're saying what is the US policy, what do the US want to do in Syria, we have to understand that at the end of the day, you have on one side a brutal regime that's massacring its population, but on the other side, you don't really see a very credible opposition that the US can viably support to put in government. And the US policy, or what the US was saying to the Saudis and to the Qataris who were backing the opposition, was give me a credible, moderate opposition I can back and I can put in power, then at least I can have a coherent and clear foreign policy. At this moment in time, it seems the US is trying to maintain its stake in Syria through the war on terrorism by combating ISIS. It doesn't want to hand Syria over on a plate to Iran and to the Russians. It needs a reason with which to make sure that it continues to have a say in the future of Syria. And that's what ISIS is doing. In terms of the Iranians, and on your question about the ballistic missile, at the end of the day, but for Iran, the Assad regime would not be surviving to this day. And then Russia came in later on. But initially, Iran was the main backer. Iran sent its militias in Iraq, crossing the border to Syria to protect the Assad regime. So when we're talking about this ballistic missile going into Syria as if it's the first time that Iran is demonstrating some sort of force in Syria, I think it's more a propaganda coup, or more Iran trying to say, look, everybody says that we were in Syria. This is proof that we're only now getting involved in Syria. I think it's all just a bluff from Iran.
Right, Simon, that is a problem for the United States, isn't it? If Bashar al-Assad is overthrown, who replaces him?
Oh, it's an enormous problem, and it's an enormous problem in great part of the United States' creation, going back to the Obama administration, as Sami was just saying. Had the Obama administration taken a completely different approach to Syria from the very earliest stages and worked with moderates that did exist at the time in the Syrian opposition, perhaps you would not have seen ultimately the creation of this tapestry of extremist forces on the ground that Claire was describing. But I think there's also confusion, really, about where the Trump administration stands with regard to Bashar al-Assad. This is the administration that fired a few rockets at Syria after that use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime, but we've heard very little from anyone in the Trump administration in recent weeks about where they stand.
Right, Simon, just one other thing. As far as policy on Syria is concerned, BuzzFeed, the online site, has published a classified document on the future relations between the United States and Russia, and it talks of 3 pillars, but we'll just talk about one of the pillars that is relevant to this show, and that is, it says that the paper proposes that the US and Russia should engage on issues of strategic interest, including the war in Syria. Now, this is a document from the State Department, I should say. So could we see an alliance between the US and Russia?
I mean, that's clearly something that Donald Trump's been talking about all the way back to the election campaign, this sort of dream that the United States and Vladimir Putin, under Donald Trump's leadership, can find a new way of working together, and Syria is one place where perhaps they can establish that. But, you know, overshadowing all of that now are the growing questions about relations between the Trump team and the Russians, the growing investigation now led by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Donald Trump is not a free agent when it comes to establishing this kind of a relationship with Russia. So I think there's huge questions about whether that's viable and viable on its merits.
Okay, Claire, I want to move on to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea right now, the DPRK. We've got this tragic story there. An American student who was released has now died, and President Trump has called the DPRK a, quote, brutal state following the death of that US student, Otto Warmbier. Let's take a listen to what the president had to say.
He spent a year and a half in North Korea. A lot of bad things happened, but at least we got him home to be with his parents, where they were so happy to see him, even though he was in very tough condition, but he just passed away a little while ago. It's a brutal regime, and we'll be able to handle it.
Now, how does the U.S. respond to this? What are its options?
You know, the death of this young man just adds to the complexity of the relationship between the United States, or maybe I should say among the United States, China, and North Korea. We had been looking at North Korea for a long time as a nuclear weapons threat. Certainly, its continued testing of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles made it a threat in the Pacific region. The enablement of North Korea and the regime in Pyongyang to survive, China enables that regime to survive. It is a criminal regime. It's tyrannical. It is dictatorial. It oppresses and murders its people by the thousands. Those are internal problems, but the external problems with regard to the threat that North Korea poses to our allies in that region, meaning South Korea first, of course, Japan and all of our other allies in the Pacific region there, makes this a definitive problem for the United States. Now, the treatment of this young man, who obviously was brutalized in North Korean custody and came home only in a coma to die within a very short time period, just adds another layer of complexity, I think, to the problem with North Korea.
Go ahead.
I just want to make one very short point. You saw in that clip there, Donald Trump says, we can handle it. We can handle this. He keeps inferring that there is a way in which the United States can go it alone against North Korea. As Nathan said at the beginning of the show, that latest tweet, we've tried, Xi Jinping's tried his best, it hasn't worked. The inference is that he's got a plan somehow to go it alone. There's no solution for the US going it alone against North Korea. There isn't an option for the US to do that beyond a reflexive sort of paroxysm of violence that then still doesn't ultimately resolve the problem.
But does a resolution of the crisis in the DPRK go through Beijing? And in this regard, hasn't Beijing done what it can do?
No, I think it's very difficult to imagine a road that doesn't go through Beijing. It may not be one road that passes through Beijing, but an entire bypass system that's going through a variety of different locations, including, of course, Seoul, including Tokyo, and including Pyongyang. He seems to concede that Xi Jinping has done what he could possibly do. That may be an attempt on the eve of these talks that we're going to focus in some degree on the trade deficit with China to put additional pressure on the Chinese. But there's no road that resolves this that doesn't in some fashion involve Beijing.
Claire, very quickly, does Donald Trump have a point when he says that this student, Otto Warmbier, should not have been left in the DPRK for so long, that the Obama administration
Absolutely, absolutely. I do not think that everything was done that was possible to be done during the Obama administration when this young man was in the North Koreans' custody. It certainly is a failing of the last administration to do all that they could to get him free. But the real problem here, and the longer-term one for the United States, is about the North Korean nuclear weapons capability, which may even also include an EMP capability, electromagnetic pulse capability, which is something that the United States cannot tolerate and either must work with China to resolve or must find another way to defend.
What is that capability, very quickly, EMP?
EMP, electromagnetic pulse, is a nuclear weapon, or it can be a nuclear weapon, exploded in the high atmosphere, which takes out the electric system beneath. And the United States electric grid is totally, the civilian grid is completely unsecured. We know that North Korea can get a ballistic missile above us because there are 2 North Korean satellites orbiting above the eastern part of the United States right now and have been for the last couple of years.
Okay, I want to move on. Sami, another story making headlines, the situation in the Gulf state of Qatar. The U.S. accuses Qatar of funding terrorism, yet it signs a $12 billion arms deal with that emirate for fighter jets. And, you know, one could add to that the fact that the United States has one of its biggest military bases overseas in that state. What are we to make of this?
I think when you say the US says Qatar supports terrorists, I think we have to go even deeper and say who is saying that Qatar supports terrorists and who is saying it's the Saudis who support terrorism. I mean, when you hear Mattis's statement to the Senate committee, you find that it's a very different use of language to that which Trump used. I have this image of my head of Trump going to Riyadh, seeing all of the gold and the grandeur that the Saudis put on for him, and him just sitting on his chair and saying, oh, you know what, everybody says you guys are bad. You guys aren't really that bad. And they say to him, yes, Trump, it's those Qataris over there who are really causing all of those problems. And Saudi has a big feud with Qatar because just as Saudi seeks to control the Muslim world through the idea of Salafism, Qatar seeks to control the Muslim world through the propping up of the Muslim Brotherhood in the various different places, in the various different countries, in Egypt and Tunisia. With regards to the US needs both of them as allies. The US has been relying on both of them as allies for a long time. during the Obama administration, the Qataris were lobbying Washington. Indeed, Washington listened to a lot of that lobbying when it came to backing the opposition movement in Libya, in particular. When it came to adopting the policies against Iran, Washington lent its ear very closely to Saudi Arabia. So I think with regards to the US, the ideal situation is that they come together. I think personally Trump doesn't understand anything about what's going on in the region. And I think this is why he's delegated a lot of responsibility to the Pentagon, who understand what's going on and who are telling him, listen, this problem between Saudi and Qatar doesn't benefit us. We need these guys to resolve their conflicts quickly so that we can proceed on the key issues of Syria and Iran, where we need these two key allies.
So, Simon, you have these countries, a lot of countries have cut relations with Qatar. What is it going to take to restore those relations?
There is terrible danger in all of this. There is no area of foreign policy right now where you can see a bigger gap between Donald Trump on the one hand and the men and women who work on him on the other hand. Just today, a few hours ago, the State Department spokeswoman said that the State Department was mystified by why the Saudis and the UAE had not come forward with evidence to support the claims they have made against Qatar, as though President Donald Trump had never himself voiced full confidence in the claims that the Saudis were making. So on that particular issue, you can see absolutely clear evidence that it's totally unclear who is at the helm of US foreign policy. And in the case of Qatar and Saudi and the Gulf, you've now got this huge rift, very unclear how much time Rex Tillerson has to spend on the phone trying to resolve it, on behalf of a president who keeps undercutting him.
Right, and how is this rift going to be repaired? What needs to happen?
Well, it has to be an enormously concerted diplomatic effort. Traditionally, it would be led by the United States, whether that is still a viable traditional role for the United States to play, to try and bring all of these players together. But it has to be a diplomatic initiative that is rooted in a realistic understanding of the situation. It is not even clear that when Donald Trump first started tweeting about Qatar, that he even understood that the US had troops on the ground there and a major coordinating military complex there.
Okay, Claire, let's go to Cuba. President Trump traveled. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I want to jump in on Qatar, if I could, very quickly. Qatar, for a long, long time, has been banker to the international jihad. It is has funded jihad groups from Al-Qaeda to the participants in the Syrian mess, Libya as well, Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and so forth.
That's a sweeping statement.
The tectonic plates in the Middle East are shifting. The problem is not just Qatar. It is the alliance that is forming, which is Qatar and Turkey jumping in now on the side of Qatar, right, which is in relationship with Iran. That is why President Donald Trump's speech in Riyadh and talks behind the scenes in Riyadh were so important, because it drew the line of the Sunni states that opposed this alliance, especially regarding Iran, but also the funding by Qatar of jihad movements.
Okay, Sami, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
I'm a bit mystified with the sweeping statement that Qatar is known for backing jihad. I'm a critic of Qatar, you can see it in my writings, but I think the main criticism that the Saudis have of Qatar is not necessarily that they're funding the jihadi or terrorist groups, or I don't think that's even the US, because if you think under Obama's tenure, Saudi was unable to move against Qatar in this particular manner because Obama, in some ways, according to the Arab circles, he was protecting Qatar. Qatar backs the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a movement that believes in democratic means to achieve power. It backed the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia, who won the elections. It backed the Muslim Brotherhood financially, huge financial firepower in Egypt for them to win the elections. It backed the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, which was a source of big contention with Saudi Arabia in Syria, and one of the reasons why the opposition disintegrated, because they couldn't find some sort of agreement. I don't buy that the argument is because Qatar funds terrorism. At the end of the day, I think this is Trump saying to the Saudis, I'm not Obama, I am your friend. What do you guys need me to do? They told him, we hate Qatar, I hate Qatar. That's the way how Trump conducted himself. And the evidence of that is that as soon as he got back to Washington, James Mattis came out and said, well, since the new emir has taken power, Qatar has been moving in the right direction. Tillerson has come out and said a statement opposite to Donald Trump. That confusion between Washington and Donald Trump shows that Trump didn't really read the situation that well. This is more a power struggle about hegemony in the region than anything to do with funding terrorism or indeed Iran.
Okay, Claire, I want to move on to Cuba. President Trump traveled to Miami, where he announced the partial rollback of President Obama's Cuba policy. Trump says that the previous administration's moves were, quote, a bad deal. Why do you think the president is reversing these policies?
Well, because Cuba, under the Castros, has been, for many decades, a tyrannical, a communist dictatorship that oppresses its own people, serves as a base of operations for Hezbollah in the Western Hemisphere, and helps to export terror and fund terrorist movements around the Western Hemisphere, for example, the FARC in Colombia. So by reversing the policies, at least in part...
facilitate the talks in Colombia?
They are the backers of the FARC in Colombia. They formerly were the backers of other groups like the FMLN in El Salvador back in the day. They have funded terrorist organizations. They host Hezbollah in Cuba right now. They are involved in the Western Hemispheric drug trade, narcotics trade, for all of these reasons, but especially also because they oppress their own people who are not free.
Right.
We needed to change that policy.
You know, but the point is, and I'm going to go to Simon for this, the point is that when President Obama announced this rapprochement with Cuba, one of the points he made was that 60 years of sanctions, other punitive measures that have been taken, have not worked. We have to change tack now.
I thought what Donald Trump did on Cuba was a masterstroke in this regard, and only in this regard. If you're a Trump supporter who voted to send him here to Washington, you go home, having heard the speech, I'm cancelling what President Obama did in Cuba, and you think that's terrific. He's made good on the promise that he was making on the campaign trail. We're heading back down a dark road to a policy that Barack Obama would argue hadn't worked for 60 years. He didn't cancel President Obama's deal with Cuba at all. He slightly diluted it. If you look at the actual impact of what he's done, the Cubans have no particular cause to be worried by what he's done, beyond the fact that there's no prospect whatsoever for the sanctions, the blockade as they call it, to be lifted against the island. But there never was a realistic expectation that that was going to happen with the Republicans dominant on Capitol Hill. So Donald Trump played very cleverly to his base by saying, I'm cancelling this deal, it was a bad deal. That's not actually what he did.
OK, Claire, just got a minute. So was it more symbolic more than anything else?
Agreed that the entire deal was not canceled. Only parts of it were. For instance, the U.S. Embassy in Cuba, in Havana, remains open. But I think symbolically, it was incredibly important that he kept his promise, his campaign promise on the trail, and that he signified with this move that we are not going to have relations as normal or normalized relationships with a communist dictatorship on our doorstep that oppresses its own people, supports terrorism, and participates in the drug trade.
Sami, I've only got about 40 seconds. Very quickly, Afghanistan has been in the headlines again. The United States saying that it wants to send 4,000 more troops. The war there, of course, is now in its 16th year. What will an extra 4,000 troops do?
Absolutely nothing. I mean, Afghanistan is one of those countries in history that has never actually been conquered. I mean, if you look throughout the time, plus also this generation of Afghans that the Americans are fighting are the same Afghans who fought against the Russians. You're fighting against a battle-hardened society. I don't think the Americans will ever win in Afghanistan. I think they've failed to win the hearts and minds of the people. And I think it's a failed endeavor. More troops just means more chaos. OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.